Hello, gorgeous change makers. Welcome to the Legacy Creation podcast. If you have ever struggled with anxiety about the environment, if you've ever struggled to have conversations with people about the environment, if you know that you are passionate about making a difference and don't know where to start, or are already well on the journey and want to know how to scale up your impact, you are going to love this conversation that I had today with Diana Pound. It was the first time I'd spoken to Diana other than by email, and it was love at first sight. I'm going to have to tell you that. It was just, I was so inspired by her. She has this sweet, humble, passionate, knowledgeable, co-creative, generative approach to ecology and the environment, and I cannot wait for you to hear it. There's a wonderful piece to listen for right at the very end, where Diana, I'm not going to call it calling out, because I think that has sort of an energy of its own, but there was a definite moment of have you thought about this moment of passion where I'd said something which Diana just needed to step in there and bring to my attention, let's say, and it left me really with my eyes wider open than they had been before. So make sure you listen to the end. Diana's incredible bio, some of the resources we talked about, how to join her program, they're all in the show notes for you. I really would love to hear your thoughts on this. Drop a message below. Let me know how you're feeling about this, what it inspired you to do, what you might do differently as a result of this. I know you're going to love Diana as much as I did. I cannot wait to join her event later this month. And I am sending you so much love in your change-making journey. Okay, so Diana, thank you so much for coming to join me on the Legacy Creation podcast. It's taken us so long because you're so busy. And I'm so happy we finally made it. Welcome.
Oh, me too.
Thank you. So you are one of the more passionate people I think I've ever come across. And your vision your mission in this world is so important. So I would love for you to just give us an introduction to yourself. And how did you come to be where you are with your work?
Yeah. Well, gosh, one of the most passionate people you've come across. That's quite an accolade. So my journey started really. I mean, I had a childhood of living in other countries because of my father's work took us there, and I think that's where my love of nature sort of started and blossomed. But there was a real sort of seminal moment for me when I was at not at university, at school. And so this is obviously decades and decades ago, and I don't know who this person was, but somebody came to our school, which wasn't a particularly sort of posh school or anything like that, it was a very ordinary school. And they talked about the future of the environment. And they used the story of the sorcerer's apprentice, and how, as the sorcerer had left the apprentice in charge, and the apprentice was decided to do some magic and make one broom that brushed up the floor become many, many brooms. And the more he tried to chop the brooms up, the more brooms they became, and the worse the problem got. And this is what this person was telling us. And he said, there are people, we need people who understand about nature and climate and environment to help us not get in the mess we're getting in ourselves in. And I kind of thought, oh, well, I wonder if I could be one of those people. I was very good at geography at the time. I loved nature. I went on to do A levels in both those subjects, biology and geography, and then decided to go to university and do an environmental science course. But this is decades and decades ago. So actually, I had relatives tell me that's not even a proper subject. What even is environment? That you'll never get a job in that. That's a waste of your life. And I can remember, I now hear talk of eco-grief and environmental shock and that kind of language. And I just think, there we were 20-year-olds, all those decades back, long before anybody else understood anything was going on. And you know, we were learning about toxic substances, we were learning about global warming, we were learning about catastrophic loss of nature. And of course, each lecturer knew what they saw coming. And this is more than 30 decades, 30 decades, 3 decades back. No, I do mean, no, what am I trying to say? More than 30 years ago. I'm not going to give away my age exactly. So, and of course, they knew their piece, but we were hearing it all. And, you know, that was really, really hard. And we sometimes joked after a day of sort of hearing catastrophic, awful things, you know, why don't we just sort of, you know, end it now? And we had those feelings, and we were 20-year-olds thinking, why does the world not realize how bad all of this is? So I came out of that degree thinking that it's all about the science, and if we can sort of shout science at people and do the scary doom and gloom thing, and people will realize how bad it is and make change. And of course, that doesn't work, and it didn't work then, and it doesn't work now. So then I found myself, my very first job was setting up one of the first nature reserves in London. And from really, I was sort of pioneering in a pioneering context then, and I've been sort of in a pioneering context one way or another since. And I think it's because just a core way I think is, how can we do this better? Is this working? Is it working fast enough? Is it working well enough? And if not, how can we do it better? And I think that's just a question that's in my head all the time, and has been since I was quite small. And so I thought, oh, it's all about great science. And then I thought, no, this doesn't seem to be convincing anybody. So I was involved in working for the government's Nature Conservation Agency in the UK. And I thought, no, it's about strong laws. We need stronger laws. And then we got stronger laws. And then we got laws that were based on European directives, which were even stronger. And then I found myself managing a coastal location. So it was setting up a new marine protected area in England. Again, one of the first that was being done. I think there were 12 and mine was one of them. And we'd got adequate, not great, because it was a marine environment. So we got adequate science. This is going back to sort of 25 years ago. We got adequate science to say it was special. We'd got all these strong laws that said it needed to be looked after, but the local authority and the port basically said, you're not doing this here, and we'll see you in the European courts. If you pursue this, we'll see you in the European courts. And I heard then about this alternate approach to making decisions called consensus building, and I couldn't, you know, designed a designed approach, not just everybody sitting down and being a bit nicer to each other, but a kind of structured approach. And I thought, well, I've no idea how that works, but it was a part-time job when they were like, then there were little people and there were no part-time jobs. So I had to make this part-time job work. So I thought, well, I've got to find out, you know, we can't be going to legal challenge like that. That gets us nowhere. So if there is an alternate approach, let me kind of find out about it. And I can remember the day before I went on that course, and I was with some people having a little picnic in somebody's garden. And I just said, you know, I just have this feeling that tomorrow's going to change my life. I'm just about to be on the cusp of something very significant. And I didn't really understand it at all. But anyway, I did that introductory course and I thought, aha. So yeah, we need science, we need good laws, but we absolutely have to get an awful lot better about the way we talk about things, bring about change. So I introduced that in that coastal situation. So then I was the ecologist and got somebody in who'd got the skills. It was very early days in it as a profession. So they'd never done anything around nature before. I think they'd done something around waste and something around nuclear. And so they came in and I worked with them over a year. And honestly, there was 20 or 30 years of hostility in that location towards nature. And that over that 1 year, 4 workshops spanned across a year and various other bits and bobs, sort of engaging sort of wider communities and speaking to the fishers and things like that, it transformed. And that legacy is still there today. That project that set up is still there. And it's like before pre-COVID, but I had to get a taxi to the airport, and the taxi, I asked the taxi driver where he was from, and these long haul sort of taxi drivers seem to come some distance before they even scoop you up and whisk you off to the airport. And anyway, he came from that area. And he said, oh, well, if you like nature, you need to come to where I live because it's really, really important for nature. And if you knew the area, it's a part of England that is quite deprived, well, very deprived and urban, and not the kind of people who would be passionate about what's on their coast or out at sea. And here was a taxi driver telling me that you've got to come because it's really important. And I just thought, wow, you know, this has really percolated right out into sort of wider society. Anyway, a lot of people wanted to know, well, how on earth did you get from something very intractable to something sort of constructive and positive and moving forward? And how did you do that? And could you come and talk to us about it? So I gave various talks, like to Cambridge University and an international thing about nature, and people were really interested. And I began to think, hang on a minute, I can make more difference learning and practicing these skills and getting them out there than I can as an ecologist. And ecological work is very important, but actually there's quite a lot of ecologists, and I don't see many people who understand how to do this, and certainly not who understand how to do it and understand how the environment functions. So that's what led to me setting up Dial of Matters, and that's my business. It's a micro, we are very tiny, but we just do such exciting things. So fundamentally, we're helping people come together in processes of conversation, a negotiation, spanning a number of workshops, to work out what better looks like, and how, even if you've got very different interests or quite conflicted with people in the room with other views, how do you negotiate a way forward to bring about change? And then we apply it to or we get asked to do work in such a vast different array of contexts. So I was just sort of thinking, I just made a little list because I'm not going to remember it all, but just in the last year, this is just a snippet in the last year. So we're currently doing something about a place called the Quantox Futures, which is an area of outstanding natural beauty in England. And they have had the foresight to realise with climate change, a lot of their valued and iconic trees will not survive the long term, and there will be all sorts of other changes to how the land is farmed and how people use it. And they want to start this conversation now about what does that look like? What is the pathway to a future that has resilience and works for nature and works for people? So we're helping them have that conversation and think about what those pathways might be. We just finished doing a tree strategy for Jersey, which is a small island between England and France. At a national level, we did something, this is all just in the last year, we did a piece of work for government around zero carbon fishing. So how does the fishing sector transition from what it's doing now to something zero carbon? We're doing a national piece building work, helping flood volunteers. This is people, ordinary citizens who volunteer when a flood happens in their location. But they can take a terrible hit from that and end up with post-traumatic stress disorder and things like that. So bringing some of them together with the agency who trains them and mobilises them when there's a flood, to say, well, okay, how can resilience be built? How can these people be supported? How can their resilience be built so that people will take on that role and can cope with it when a flood happens, and aren't, you know, they can be out helping their community whilst their own house is being flooded, and that's a pretty extraordinary thing to be doing. So it's about how can those people be supported. Then we did something with young people, which we just finished, which was, it was a national research, but it was creating knowledge with young people about how they see nature and natural places, and that will go into some standards for nature and natural places in urban areas and other areas, which so far has been set by what adults think, and this is about what the youth voice needs to be in there. Internationally, what dolphins and whales in the Mediterranean, disaster resilience in the UK overseas territories, global water futures. I don't know. You just hear it. It's just right across. And about 2 weeks ago, I was asked to go and be on an advisory group for a massive new bit of research about electric vehicles and community battery charged from, I don't know, renewables so a renewable charged battery set in communities, so people, it's not off grid. So the very, very beginning of that piece of research. What a spectrum. So it's incredibly exciting. And pre-COVID, I did lots of work in other countries too. So Africa and the Caribbean and Guyana and India. And I've trained people in the remote mountains of Kazakhstan in a ceremonial yurt where they were all Russian-speaking water managers from across various Stanian countries, and so we were right across language and cultural differences. But anyway, it was about gender-sensitive water management, but they realised conflict was a really significant part of that, so they wanted us to go over and do a bit of training about, you know, how do you understand conflict and how can you move people out of it? I'm not armed or that kind of conflict, obviously, but conflict over resources or nature. Yeah, there you go. That's a spectrum.
Wow. It's extraordinary. I could sit and listen to you talk about it forever, and now I have this pictures sort of in my mind of you in these incredible places. And what really strikes me is that this seems to me unique in that you have you have all this knowledge about the environment, and then you have this skill set of creating the relationship for people to come to consensus,
Mhm.
and then also this skill set of which I've seen in your sort of the things I've seen you put out online, that you know how to talk to people in a way that brings this balance between urgency and not terrorizing the living daylights out of people.
Well, that's great, because that's certainly something I feel very passionately about. You know, I did come out, as I said just now, about from environmental science thing. We kind of got to shout the stats at people, shout the numbers at people, terrify people. But of course, the fear response that humans have, we're wired. If we're going to have a fear response, it's wired to something sort of, you know, we're trying to avoid a car crash, or a lion's about to jump out in the bush and bite us on the rear end. So that's what we're wired to, and that's very immediate, very short term. And to think that we would mobilize change around nature, climate, and social justice by frightening people, it just doesn't work. And there's so much psychology now coming out about why it doesn't work and what does. So I mean, I think it's fair to say that, you know, that emotional reaction I had way back when I was doing a degree and thinking, oh my goodness, this is really serious. I've lived with that all my life. That never goes away. My LinkedIn feed, because I work across, you know, climate, land, fish, sea, coral reef, because I'm working across so many different sectors and then connect with those people. My LinkedIn feed, honestly, by morning coffee, you could think it's game over, let's give up, because that is so much of what all the environmentalists are churning out is how bad everything is getting. And, you know, I will sometimes, when there's a new report about, I don't know, nature loss or something, I will go off and cry and lose it for a bit. But then I just feel like, you know, well, what the heck? You've got to sort of dust yourself off and crack on, because, you know, it is really serious, but it's not game over. And if, you know, if we cross 1.5, which I do think is fairly inevitable, but 1.6 is better than 1.7, and 1.7 is better than 1.8, and you know, and so and if you think about species and species loss, or loss of beautiful, wonderful, rich habitats, then, you know, one less species lost is one less species lost. So it's kind of like it doesn't there's no get out here. You know, we've all got to work with whatever sphere we're in to do our best. And that's sort of the resolve I had at university, really. You know, people say, how do you keep going? And at universities, all those decades back, I resolved that I would try and play whatever my tiny, tiny part was to keep things as good as possible for as long as possible, in the hope the world woke up. And I've had a lifetime of being at dinner parties. Oh, you're an environmentalist, you're a tree hugger, you know, just being dismissed. Nobody's interested. And oh my goodness, they're interested now. And we've crossed some really big social tipping points around people's concern for nature and environment and climate. And yeah, and I'm just really passionate that environmentalists have got to start changing the way we communicate with others. So I try and walk that talk. You know, I realise the doom and gloom had this very negative effect. I realise that it caused people to either go into sort of quite extreme action, or and I'm not saying I support direct action. I do think that needs to happen, but or be so apathetic, or just like, I can't deal with this. This is just too much. And that's partly that psychologically our brains are wired to think in the short term and local, because that makes sense. You know, if we come from people who lived on the savannah or whatever, and you need to know what the threats were around you locally and in the short term. And of course, environment is longer term and big scale. And it's really hard for our brains to even grasp that. So I think the doom and the gloom and the fear, do I think we need to understand what's going on? Yes. Do I think constant pumping out of fearful, issue-based communication is advancing anything very much? No, I don't. I think we've got to tell stories of action. We've got to tell stories, certainly with the environment and within ourselves. We've got to start inspiring each other and being a bit more positive about being hopeful and constructive. So I'm glad you've seen that on my LinkedIn post. Occasionally I breach my own rules about don't share something awful. But so sometimes I just go, oh my goodness, and like something or share it. And I think, no, that's not helping anything. That's not helping. So don't do that. You know, the people who need to know that science and that information know it. And the rest of us need to all know it is serious. It is not game over. Well, let's get on and make a difference. And I actually just, in terms of positivity and knowing I was talking to you, I just thought that I just look at some of the posts I've posted on LinkedIn over the last couple of months, because I think our brains, and there's another bit of psychology, that our brains filter for the bad news. We want to see our brains obviously want to pick up a threat. So they filter for bad news. And the media know that, so they pump at us lots of bad news. And where do we ever see really the good news? So I try and actively look for the good news. It's partly to maintain my own psychological well-being that I do that. And here's just a few things. So a week ago, this is in the UK, so I know this might go wider than that, and there will be different stats in different countries. But a week ago, there was a survey that 81% of people in the survey believe nature is under threat and more should be done to protect and restore it. And 48% said they're willing to take action. And there's some research that says that for 20% of a group to start thinking and doing things differently tips the whole group. Well, then we've tipped. If we've got 48% willing to take action, that is evidence the UK has socially tipped. And I've got very similar stats that were done around climate change internationally, so lots of different countries, and very, very similar stats about climate change from across countries, so including African countries, you know, small island states, America, wherever. We've socially tipped. So people are very worried about some of the tipping points in terms of ice melt or acidification of the ocean or loss of coral reefs or, you know, changing weather patterns. And there are things to be concerned about there. Of course there are. But we've also got to be mindful of the social tipping points that actually make it much more possible that change can happen. So there's one great bit of news. Then there was another piece of news last week that bison, bear and beavers and wolves are all making a comeback across Europe. Hooray for the big animals. And then 2 weeks ago, so 116 major business and financial institutions wrote an open letter to our new Prime Minister to ask her to deliver robust net zero plans. And they represent about 1.8 trillion of market capitalization and include companies like Sky, Amazon UK, IKEA, Coca-Cola, and in the financial world, Zurich Insurance, Aviva. So the heads of those organizations, 116 of them said, we want a net zero plan. That's tipped. Business world has tipped. Now, some of that greenwashing, for sure, some of it will be greenwashing. And it's easy to write a letter and have it published and get a bit of, I don't know, kudos out of that. But that's a social tipping point, and we influence each other's behavior. And so that's tipped. Then there's some research, I can't quite remember where I read it, but anyway, that economically, regardless of what governments do, from a market perspective alone, we are past fossil fuels. We are the market sensible thing, the economically sensible thing to do is renewables right across the world. So regardless of what any governments do, the institutions that invest and that develop are now well going down the renewable routes, and some of the fossil fuel side of things are sort of in a bit of a panic because they know they're going to have lots of stranded assets. And I know there's been an up bump because of Ukraine and change in fuel prices and all the rest of it. So I know that, you know, it is we currently have a, you know, re-looking at fossil fuels, but that's just going to be temporary, because what else Ukraine shows us is that we need to have energy independence, and that's best achieved through renewables. So in the longer term, it's going to put an even more oomph towards renewables. So there's actually, once you start digging, there's lots of good signs, lots of good news. And let's start sharing that and inspiring each other and our own personal stories of change as well.
I love that, because it's too easy to use bad news to let yourself off the hook rather than activate yourself. Like I know we have this internal I won't say who, but like somebody I know is always nagging somebody else I know about the environment, and this other person, they're very elderly, and they're, well, wasn't our fault, we didn't do it, I don't know why you're blaming us. And then there's this whole conflict thing comes up, and then there's this defensiveness around, oh, whereas actually this feeling that it is worth doing something, that
Yeah,
it
for
is
sure.
worth making yourself uncomfortable, is so inspiring.
But I think it's also about how we speak to each other about this. And um, again, naming and shaming or pushing at people doesn't work. It's psychologically, you know. Somebody did it to me yesterday. Somebody doing some work with, and they wanted to start a workshop showing a picture of something really upsetting. And I said, well, I understand your heart for that, I understand your emotions for that, I understand why you really want to do that, but you're doing it because you want to catalyze real urgency and change, and it'll actually have the opposite effect. So if that's what you want to do, don't show that picture. Um, and we need to understand these psychological processes that are going on. And so if you push at people, it actually causes people to so like if I made you, shamed you because I don't know, I found out you flew somewhere, I said, oh, you flew, Lisa, oh, did you fly? Oh, okay, you flew. Did you carbon offset? Oh, you didn't. You know, and make you feel like instantly you're beginning, oh my goodness, and feel a little bad about yourself. And our brains will go into this thing where we want to feel like we're good people. So this comes from some climate change psychology that I read about 20 years ago. So we want to feel like we're good people. So if you make me feel bad about myself, my brain will be scrambling to sort of, you put me in something called cognitive dissonance, and my brain will be scrambling to say, oh, okay, maybe I'm not a good person then. Maybe Diana's right, I'm not a good person. But I am a good person. I believe I'm a good person, and my brain wants me to feel like I'm a good person. So actually its next default is, well, Diana must be wrong. The stats must be wrong. So if we push at people and make them feel bad about themselves, actually it will just have the wrong effect. It's not going to inspire action and change. So, you know, regardless of whether you're talking to colleagues, whether it's talking to friends or family, whether it's talking at sort of national levels, sort of putting messages out more widely, it's got to be about like we've all got different capacities. We're all trying to do our best. So let's just share what we're doing and how we can do a bit more. And so understanding that. So for me, obviously, I run my own business and I put in a lot of hours. But I also try and give a little bit free to something international, something national, something local. And the local thing that I help the local community sort of think about doing was a can-do cafe. And the can-do cafe idea is that the village hall is hired once a month. It's set up like a cafe, tea, cake, whatever. At one side, there'll be somebody who knows something about whatever the theme of the cafe is, but they're not going to give a formal presentation. They're just there to chat as people go up and pick up a leaflet, have a little bit of a chat with them about something. We've got a repair cafe person over in another corner. And then we've got an upvoting board, which is simply people put on post-its. Well, this is what I'm trying to do around this theme. And other people can come in later and say, well, actually, I think that's a really great idea. And they can push it up the board. And then the top ones can be shared with the community. So amongst us, some of us are innovating around this, and here's some inspiration. And then you've created a sort of like, well, if they can do it, I can do it. You know, this is somebody from my community. It's not our community is doing that. I can do that. And that's a real key piece. Like to inspire in each other a can-do attitude. So if they can do it, I can do it. But there were some people in the group, the environment group in the community, who wanted to take a more negative approach and sort of do the bit of the shouty doom and gloom, do you not realise how bad it is kind of approach. But I said, well, let's try this other approach. Let's try, like, we're all, you know, some of them are retired and they've got far more capacity than me to personally do green things. And that's brilliant. So inspire other people who are retired, who've got those capacities, got those times to plant their own veg gardens and eat as local as your back garden, or even got a back garden. So let's all just inspire and encourage each other and not take this sort of shouty, disapproving, shaming approach, because it backfires, it doesn't work.
I've noticed several. I noticed those friends. My sister is really good at looking at everything she does for the environment. She really inspires me. But I've noticed those friends and family who are really conscious about it often start their sentences with, "I don't want to be an eco bore, but," and you can just feel the sort of grounds downness of them, that they're so passionate. They've informed themselves, and it's frustrating for them to see how other people are behaving. So what have you learned that those sort of grassroots warriors can use in terms of spreading their message or not spreading their message? How did they become everyday activists without being called an eco-bore?
Yeah, so I think people who care passionately about nature and environment, climate change, can obviously come over with a lot of fervency and a lot of urgency. And I think we've just got to all shift our approach. We've got to speak to people as with great respect, finding out where they've got to, what they're getting on with, and then people come to me and they start telling me what they're getting up to. It often starts with recycling, and recycling. This is something what I wanted to say, that it's almost like people think, oh, well, if I do recycling, I'm doing my bit. And there is actually, I've got a real concern that the whole idea of our carbon footprint was actually invented by the fossil fuel industry. They wanted us to feel responsible, and they're not responsible. And they also wanted us to get also busy worrying about our own carbon footprint or our own environmental impact, that we don't do the more strategic things that could lobby and change the system. So I think when people tell me, I want to come back to them, what do you do? But so when people tell me they're recycling, part of me goes, oh, that's just kind of the least of it. But I don't respond that way. I will try and say to them, well, that's great. Can you do that more? Or, what else are you exploring that you could do around environment, climate, nature? What else are you thinking of doing? What else do you think you already are doing? And sometimes people are doing things and they hadn't really thought it that way. So they say, oh, well, I make sure that there's, I built a hedgehog house in the garden, or I'm making sure that I've got a little bee house attached to the house, or, I give some money to a wildlife organization. And people are actually doing far more often than they realize they're doing. So then it's like finding out what people are doing and encouraging to think, is there anything more they could do? Could they ramp that up in any way? What kind of barrier might they overcome? How could they solve it? And so it's almost like a coaching kind of conversation. Obviously, Lisa, this is completely your territory, you know about that more than me, but it's kind of asking coaching type conversations rather than giving advice or telling people what they ought to do, and sort of nurturing whatever little, I don't know, flames are already in their life around doing nature and environment, and sort of fanning those a bit and encouraging more. So I think that's one thing, that we've got to have a different attitude in all our conversations. And if you want to learn more about that and you're hearing this in time, then we've got an event on October the 19th, which will be looking at some of those skills. And then when it comes to what to do, if this sounds a bit radical, I think, I don't know many environmentalists would say this, but if recycling and walking to work and running your own veg patch is taking up so much of your time that you can't do the really big impact things, like, where is your money? Put your money in green banks, shift your pension. What is your money doing? And where is that? What is your vote doing? Can you lobby? Can you, put some pressure on politically if you're a member of a party, or join a party, or write to your MP or your elected person in whatever country you're in? So if you're doing small personal things and you've only got limited time, and you're not doing the big stuff, the bigger things that have a greater, bigger, broad scale impact, then actually maybe that's not the best use of your time. If you can do it all, please do it all. But if you've only got limited resources of time and money, which many of us have, because I don't know, we're working, we've got families, whatever, care and responsibilities. If you've only got limited resource to give to this, try and green up everything you're doing in a way that doesn't take more money and time, and then use your time and money for the most impactful things. And so, you know, I'd say that was about voting. That's about like your energy provider. Can you shift to a better greener energy provider? I made a list. You know, set up a can-do cafe in your place of work or in your community, so you're all mobilizing each other. And then it's also about being contagious. So our behavior is really contagious. And so if you go on social media, not some sort of preachy way that, oh, you know, I'm not virtue signal, but sort of saying, you know, I'm really challenging myself with I don't know, walking to work more often, and it's been quite a challenge. This is the challenges I've overcome. This is the benefits I've got. Tell your story. It's called a hero's journey, a story of sort of like where you are now, challenges you overcame, benefits you experience, and then telling others about it. So tell your hero's story of something you're doing, and get it on social media, and invite other people. Is there any suggestions you can make to me? So again, you're not coming over preachy. You're inviting other friends to say, "Oh, that's great," because you know, I'm doing this, and maybe that's an idea, and you know, you can start a little conversation, because we can influence, I think it's up to 4 times, so our friends or something like that, by putting something on social media. And that's a really effective way to increase this tipping point that it turns out we've already crossed, but we'll mobilize more people to do more, because again, they'll have that, well, if, you know, if Lisa can do it, then I can do it. You know, Lisa's a very busy woman. If she could do that, I could do that. So I think, yeah, share what you're up to, and keep encouraging yourself to do more, and don't let yourself off the hook thinking, oh, well, I'm recycling, so I've done my bit and I can ignore it now, because there's more, there's always more. And don't just think climate and waste. So waste is recycling. Climate is about our energy, but think about nature too, because nature is in a very serious load of trouble, and anything you can do around nature, around any pieces of land you've got, you know, if it's a garden or a window box or just a plant pot outside your front door for pollinators, and but also give your money to some reliable and trustworthy wildlife habitat caring enterprise that is in your country or your location, and support them, go out and do practical action there, because it's the climate change in nature, it's like they've been separated, and they're not. They're all part of a system in trouble. And it's really an accident of some decisions made, I think it was in '92, about we'll separate climate and nature into 2 different global conventions, and the climate attracted much more funding and resources and time and energy and research, and nature less, because nature always ends up being the poor relation. But it's, you know, it's part of a system in trouble, so it's about all of it, thinking about all of it.
So, you know, I have a garden. I live near woods, but it's also, you know, a pretty residential area. We basically a few trees in my garden, even, and my neighbors all do. We've basically had enough of the trees cut away to plonk our houses here in 1980, whenever they were built. So here I am in suburbia. What are some of the most impactful things I can do for nature?
In your garden?
In my garden, or in the woods. You know, I walk my dogs in the woods every day.
Find out who manages the woods, and see if there's anything you can do to help, because some woods are actively managed, and they'll have work parties to you know, keep the good health of the woodland. But then in your garden, you can do things like, well, don't use any pesticides or herbicides. Do companion planting or something like that to reduce any pesticide in the pests you don't want. Water, get in some water, even if it's, you know, dig a lovely big pond if you've got space for a lovely big pond, and if not, something smaller, and plant it with wildlife stuff. Don't put goldfish in it, but plant it with wildlife stuff, and the newts will come and the dragonflies will come. They'll find you, and that would be lovely. When you're planting, think about drought resistant plants, because that's the future, and also great pollinating plants. So you can Google, you know, drought resistant pollinators. If you've got sort of the solid wooden fences that developers love to stick up around property, then speak with a whole bunch of neighbours, especially if it connects with the woodland, and create hedgehog spaces, just like a little round sort of, little gap in the fence, so that hedgehogs can start moving much more freely around that space. Because hedgehogs in England, I presume you're in England, so hedgehogs in England are in real trouble. So that helps them move about and have bigger ranges and have more prey, and will make a connection between your garden, which they will just see as another habitat, like a little grassy area in their range, with the woodland. So there are some things. I hope that no mow May, don't mow your meadow, don't mow your grass in May, because even if it's a fairly boring seed mix, the seed heads still come up and provide food before other plants come up for various creatures to feed them.
I heard about No Mow May for the first time last year, just as I had moved into this house. And before that, I was renting a house for a few years that just had a bit of pebble courtyard. So yes, I have absolutely stuck with No Mow May.
Mine, because I'm busy, mine became No Mow May, Jungle June, Awful August. But it finally kind of got cut in some disarray about, I don't know, 4 weeks ago. I don't know what the neighbours thought. I think they thought, oh my goodness, this woman's completely lost the plot now. It's a jungle there. But anyway.
You need a t-shirt that says, I'm not lazy about my grass. I'm doing it for
I did think I needed a little sign. So there you go. I'm too busy doing environmental work at some national or international level, and this is feeding the birds and the bees and the rodents and stuff like that. So just leave me alone. No, I did need to. It did get tatty, but yeah.
Oh, Dan, you're so inspiring. So the last time I felt this inspired and positive, it was before the pandemic, and I was deep in China. I was near Chengdu.
Wow.
And I went to a panda reserve. And it's one of the...
I'm now green with envy.
Oh my gosh. It's absolute bucket list for me. Panda's just been my spirit animal from tiny. And I got to meet and feed baby panda. I mean, you're not allowed to touch them. But there was this extraordinary moment. I wrote about it on my Facebook page recently. But one of the babies, I was holding it sort of bamboo for it to take. And we're not allowed to touch them. You're not allowed to wear nail varnish. You have to have washed everything off. They're so affected by any chemicals. And I was holding this bamboo, and the baby panda reached out and put his hand on mine. And my heart burst. I was like, this is... When I heard I couldn't touch them. But there was the most extraordinary, we saw a film about the gentleman who is in charge of actually increasing numbers of panda now, and the way that the Chinese government were actually buying up whole swathes of forest areas, buying the farms from those areas to relocate people, knocking the farms down, and then putting panda back in there, and hearing about how panda numbers were coming up. I left there thinking, I'm doing this for the pandas. Like, if I know the pandas are safe, then this is what I'm going to do. So you've given me that feeling of focusing on what can be done rather than worrying about what might be too late for.
Can I just pick you up on that panda story a bit? Because there is, and obviously I don't know about the context, so I'm not commenting specifically on that context, but it just sort of flags something, which is that there is a very serious sort of background to nature conservation, which is very colonial. It's colonial values. And those colonial values included displacing peoples who were actually indigenous peoples who were actually part of the ecosystem, and displacing them from their lands in the interest of nature for Western people. So there is, for me, a sort of, this has got to be about social justice, indigenous lifestyles and knowledges, and finding ways that work for people and nature, not displacing people into poverty or prostitution, or are completely away from their heritage and their lands and their tribal ways of being. So I'm just a little caught. I mean, obviously I don't know about the specifics of that, and I don't know if it was really well done or anything, but I'm always a bit cautious with the buying up land, displacing people story, because it comes from quite some very strong colonial values right back in the early years of conservation in Africa and India and places like that, that Western countries did, and there's a lot to be rectified around that. So I just have a question mark. But displacing people to benefit nature, no, we've got to be thinking about solutions that work for both, and integrated systems and low impact ways of living with, and stuff like that, I think.
Yeah, thank you for picking that up. So, and you know what, I asked the question of the local guides because for me I suppose it's different in that, one moment, excuse me, it's the Chinese government, so it's looking after their Chinese animal, the Chinese, it's not a West versus East piece coming in, but there's also this huge element of pride about the panda and love for the panda. And I think we all know that most governments are good at justifying whatever they do. So yes, I did ask the question. And I, what I'm sitting with as you say that is I took the answer very trustingly, because I was so swept away with the joy of what they were doing. And that people were being relocated, and being made wealthy through it and those things. But it's such an important thing for me that I'm just starting to learn more about colonialization and that whole side of my history as white British woman.
I mean, it's once you start looking at the colonial roots of conservation and the value, we're just putting together a course for one of the environmental organizations in this country on inclusive engagement, and we're going to have a couple of slides about the roots of colonialism and how that went from nature conservation into environment more broadly, and then how it still affects the way that an awful lot of agencies and environmentalists behave towards others without even being conscious of that influence from way back. So the kind of like, the experts know best and need to tell other people. We need to go into an area and tell people how they ought to live better. We want to take areas for wilding, which is a big agenda in Europe, and to renaturalize and allow natural processes to blossom again. And in doing that, I've heard somebody who's very passionate about wilding say, we've designated this area on a map and we're going to wild it. And I said, so do people live there? And it's farmed and there's some communities and so on. And that's just another form of colonialism. You might be a white person going into a white area, but you're still coming with those sets of values of, I know best, this is best for the future, we're going to tell you, we're going to impose this on you. It's still, get with those people and work out what a transformational change could be, how they could farm, like if you went into a sheep farming area, say, which in the UK at least are areas that the uplands could be very, overgrazed, and they could be really great, much richer in nature. But if you go into a community where there's a lot of sheep farming and, you just say, yes, we're going to wild this, well, the sheep farmer would turn around to you and say, well, I'm open to new ways of doing things, but if the sheep numbers go below a certain level, you're going to collapse the vet will disappear, the sheep shearers will disappear, the feed merchant will disappear, the market will disappear. And there's a point at which you will collapse the entire sector and our cultural heritage and our way of living here. And it's gone back hundreds and hundreds of years. So then there needs to be a conversation about then, well, how do we transition? How do we transform? How do we have more nature in a way that works for people and for nature and for climate? What does that look like? We're an innovative, inspired people who can, come up with all sorts of new inventions. Well, let's have those conversations instead of the battles of, we want it for nature, we want it for sheep farming, or at sea, it's kind of, we want it for nature, we want it for fishing, or those kind of battles that we as Dialogue Matters get in the middle of and help people find ways forward from. So you know, it's trying to look for those both and when I talk about win-win, I don't mean or consensus building, I mean genuine, everybody is maximizing the benefit as much as they can from the agreement. So it's not like somebody, you know, that we've got a compromise where you get 50% of what you want and I get 50% of what I want, and we call that a win-win. No. How can we move towards you getting 80 or 90 or even 100% of what you want and me getting 100% of what I want? And that's our goal when we're facilitating negotiation. And sometimes we see those brilliant, perfect breakthrough thinkings, and suddenly think, oh my goodness, we can have more. We can all have more of what we need out of it. And that, if you start with that goal, you're more likely to find it than if you start with some power struggle over who's going to win, you know, the scientists or the sheep farmers or the ecologists or whatever. Yeah.
You've inspired me so much. You've
I never really think of myself as an inspirational person.
you know, right? Because you're that's the thing, isn't it, though, that the thing which is most natural to you just is natural to you. And so why, but I'm so inspired. I'm inspired because I'm so relieved that I almost feel like I've got permission to seek out good news and create more good news from that energy.
Yeah.
I'm also inspired because I've had more of my ignorance exposed.
Oh.
In the best way. You know, this is one of the
Okay.
things I love about these conversations, because
I don't want
one
to
of
make anybody feel bad about themselves. I'm sure you
oh
know tons
no
of things that I have no knowledge of at all.
no, exactly. You know, the thing is that I posted a quote that I'd said just in as I was talking one day, that the lens of privilege is so opaque. Like I was there as, for instance, that's completely opened up another level of thinking for me about the Chinese farmers up in those mountains, that I had thought about them in the moment, asked the question, accepted the answer. But I was so taken with the pandas and meeting the pandas that I haven't gone back to consider that person, even if they've had money put in their hands, is now displaced, is now somewhere else. And that I've another level of thinking about colonialization. I actually downloaded a book the other day on the environment and colonialization. I just happened to see it when I was searching for books for something else. So it's opened up another level of me recognizing something I didn't know that I didn't know. That's what I mean.
I
And for
think this
me, that's always
awareness,
inspiring.
yeah, I think this whole sort of like, did I know the colonial roots of conservation? Yes, because way back when I did my degree, you know, part of what we did was environmentally, the history of environmentalism and so on. So I did know it, but I think it's coming much more fully into view in the last few years, and that's thanks to the work of Black Lives Matter and other people. And I'm an IUCN commissioner, which is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and there's this World Congress that I so wanted to get to. I've never been able to afford to go, and it was in France, and I was desperate to go, and then the pandemic, and I had to shield, so I couldn't go. I engaged online, I ran some masterclasses online and stuff like that, but I really wanted to be there. But one of the reasons I wanted to be there is because there's lots of Indigenous people who come forward and share their knowledges, very, very different ways of knowing about nature and the environment than sort of science, Western trained brains, and don't see it as separate. You know, it's one. We are, you know, they don't see any kind of separation between us and nature and how it all works. And I really wanted to go to some of those events in person and hear their music and hear their stories and hear their ways of knowing and learn. And so I just think it's much more coming, you know, I think Western people may be at last having a bit of humility around this and being willing to learn. And like, I mean, I want to know the book. Oh, you send me the link for the book, because I want to read the book.
I will.
Because I want to learn more about all of this myself. And we're, even as an organisation, we're questioning, as we're doing this course on inclusive engagement, you know, we're questioning some of our own language and reflecting on how we say things. Like sometimes I might talk about, we work at different levels of education. Well, that's a bit flipping elitist, isn't it? I mean, you know, I've worked with fishers who don't have literacy, but their knowledge, they've just got another whole knowledge, and they tell it through story and narrative and experience, and their knowledge is just held in very different ways, but they're not uneducated. It's just a different type of knowing. And I've worked with Indigenous peoples from the tribes in Guyana in South America, where we had the most extraordinary experience, one of the best courses, where we had people who were so trained, they got multiple degrees from like Harvard and Cambridge like that, and places like that, working around environment in Guyana. And then folk from some of the protected areas and the tribes from the protected areas, all on the same course. And we just had such a brilliant time. And we talked about using techniques for building agreement and finding out what needs to change, and building sort of visions and hopes and pathways to change through song and picture and story, and ways that don't require anybody to read or write. And we went up to those areas, and we were swimming after the training, and we were swimming in a waterfall, and I was just loving it. And then suddenly the people we were with saying, we must go, we must really go now. And we're suddenly terribly urgent about it. And it was because dusk falls quite suddenly and the jaguars come out. Well, I'd have got gobbled up. So you know, so there's not levels of education. It's different types of knowledge that are shared and held in very different ways. And so we're learning too. We're definitely not arrived on all of this, and I'm not sure we ever will, but we are learning too about inclusive language and being curious and being open to very different ways of knowing things.
I love it. I love it. Diana, I just want to make you a big pot of fair trade coffee and talk to you all day. And I know that coffee's terrible for the environment, so I won't start that conversation. But I just would love to listen to you all day. And lucky me, I'm already signed up to come on your program that you're running.
Oh, I'm really pleased to hear that, Lisa.
So would you just take maybe one more minute to tell people about that, because I would love as many people as possible to come and hear more about you.
Yeah, sure. I'd like to say that, and then I've got a quote I'd like to finish on, if that's okay.
Nice.
Yeah. So I'll just talk about this event. It's not our usual thing at all, but this concern that I've talked about during this discussion around that environmentalists are kind of getting it wrong in the way they're sort of shouting statistics and fearful things and maps that are going ever redder with heat and stuff like that at people, and thinking that catalyzes big change. And I really want other environmentalists to have found out what we found out. So on the 19th of October, this is in 22, so who knows who knows who's gonna listen to this and when. So on the 19th of October, we've got a morning, and there's 4 speakers, and one of them is a chap called Chris Demare, and he's a neuroscientist working around climate and understanding this business of what goes on psychologically for people when they talk about and hear about, and what works. So he's also going to talk, I don't know if he calls it the hero story, but that idea of, you know, focusing on action stories, not issue-based negative stories. Then we've got somebody called Livy, who knows about behavior change, and so she's going to be speaking about how all sorts of insights around behavior change. Then we've got somebody called Charlie, who is a climate coach, so she's going to talk to us about using conversations, using that coaching ethos. And then I'm going to speak only, I'm not entirely sure what yet, it is only in a few weeks, but I've got so many different presentations, I'm just trying to see what the others are presenting, come in with something complementary rather than contradictory. So, or not contradictory, it wouldn't be contradictory, but you know that complements and doesn't duplicate, that's what I mean. And then after the speakers, we're going to break into workshops, and so Chris Demare is doing a masterclass, and then my team will be putting on sessions to build on what Livy and Charlie have said, so that we can all go away with some sort of practical skills under our belt.
Wow. So
we hope that catalyses change. It's all not for profit. We're not going to make any money out of this at all, I don't think. But quite possibly, you know, we're subsidising it. If just supposing we suddenly get an uptick in attendance, then if it does make money, we're going to give it to an initiative that I've sort of also tried to catalyse, which is maybe going to be called the Can Do Online Magazine or something like that. They're playing around with names, but it will be an online magazine to share stories, to share those heroes' journeys of people from wherever doing interesting things for nature, climate, and what they've overcome and what they've achieved, and to inspire other folk. So that's
fantastic.
Yeah, so look forward to seeing you there, Lisa.
I will be there, and we will put the sign up link for the event in the show notes so that people can access them.
That's great. And from all over the world. So we often have people from many other countries join things. So this is not just a UK thing. So yeah.
One
Yeah.
question that people always ask is, will there be a recording if they can't make it live?
We haven't fully sorted all of that out yet. So because there's sort of consenting issues with some of the speakers and their intellectual property and stuff like that. So we haven't got that. I mean, yes, it would be great to share that more widely, but I can't say at this point that we're quite sure what we're doing around all of that. Yeah.
Okay, so
shall I finish with my quote?
Yes, please.
Okay, so this comes from somebody who really, really inspires me. She used to be UN Secretary for the climate change. I've met her. Her name's Christiana Figueira, and she set up an organization called Outrage and Optimism. And if you want to sort of boost your can-do-ness, then subscribe to that. Anyway, she's written a wonderful book called, I think it's called The Future We Choose. Anyway, this is a couple of quotes from her book. So our individual boundaries are porous. We infect each other with ills and joys. So let's infect each other with stubborn optimism and determined action. A compelling vision is like a hook in the future. It connects you to pockets of possibilities that are emerging and pulls them into present. So hold on to that. So hold on to the possibility that we can turn the curve, we can have clean air and clean seas and thriving communities and lots of nature, and that we can learn to live in a richer, cleaner, I don't mean richer affluent, I mean sort of more diverse in terms of nature and so on world. And that's the future. So let's hold on to that.
I'm holding. Thank you for you. Thank you for all the work you're doing for the world. And thank you for being here with us today. And I will see you on October 19th.
You will. Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you. Okay.